Hello, world history students. This is the spring semester extra credit review. We're just going to go down these questions and talk about them, but also we're not just going to laundry list these questions. This exam has 42 questions on it, and if I just laundry list these and give you the bare basics, you're not going to do very well. We have had a long year and a long semester. We've learned a lot. So it's time to do more than just that. It's time to do a recap and have a look back and see where we've been and put it all together. So the answers to these first few questions are going to be pretty involved. Once we've established a few important pieces of context, those rest of these questions, they'll go a bit more quickly. But like I said, it's the end of the year, and it's a time to look back over some of the main concepts that we've studied. We've studied a lot of concepts, and we're going to have a little more perspective than perhaps we had when we were in the middle of all this. So this first question here is describe the scientific revolution. Now, I'm going to say a lot more about this than you can actually put here in this amount of space. So put down the main things that I say, but I'm going to provide some context. So here is some context. In the fall semester, we ended with the Middle Ages, which lasted in the Western world for many centuries and was deeply entrenched in the European economy, European society, European politics, European culture, and it took a lot of different developments to slowly leverage our way out of those Middle Ages. When exactly did the Middle Ages end? That's hard to say. It depends on what factors you're looking at. The biggest factor was the expansion of trade, commerce, industry, banking, capital. We also talked about the Renaissance and the impact that it had. We talked about the enormous game-changing power of the printing press. We talked about the age of exploration and conquest and settlement. We talked about the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation that came after that. And all of these developments gradually and cumulatively chipped away at the Middle Ages over time by giving more people more access to more ideas and new ways of looking at the world and looking at themselves. Then we have this fifth factor that we're looking at in this whole process, and that was the scientific revolution. In the scientific revolution, scientists began to question what they had been taught by the ancients, such as the ancient Greek scientist and physicist and philosopher Aristotle. These people in the Middle Ages had believed these ancient scientists for centuries. But now they question what Aristotle said about the structure of the universe itself, the sun, the moon, the earth, the planets, the stars. And they also question what ancient scientists had said about such things as the nature of the human body and the physics of how objects even move. The study of motion itself was a matter of great interest and great curiosity for these scientists of the scientific revolution. Some important takeaways about this scientific revolution. Number one, these scientists developed new methods, such as empiricism. Empiricism, which is also called inductive reasoning, says only trust what you can observe and measure. And that was very important. Math became more important because of this. New instruments that could expand our power to observe things it became better and better because of this, such as new instruments like the telescope. Second thing to take away is the importance of physical laws. The scientists of this scientific revolution, they were attempting to identify and describe physical laws that govern the way the universe worked. In other words, they were trying to kind of crack the codes and discover the rules that the universe has to obey. And these scientists, third, got a lot of cultural pushback, particularly from the church. So the next question is, we got a little introduction here. Who were these most famous scientists of the scientific revolution, and what did they do? First, let's make a quick observation. All these scientists, they're all men. Why? Why does it seem like almost all of the historical accomplishments that we have studied are made by men? Gender inequality has been a big theme of our course throughout the entire year. Throughout the ages and across cultures, women have been systematically blocked from all kinds of endeavors, most importantly, from just getting an education at all. So it's not that women were not capable of contributing equally to things like science and the Enlightenment and civics and art and literature and all kinds of other things. It's that they were intentionally prevented from doing so by men who make the rules and who knew and who still know exactly what they are doing. So at the end of the day, it's not about a difference in ability, it's about a difference in power and control. Another thing before we talk about these scientists to observe is that these men were all highly religious. Some were Catholic, some were Protestant, but none of them saw a significant contradiction between their scientific discoveries and the God that they believed in or the scripture that they read. And a third thing, there's a thread here as we follow these scientists, and that thread is the heliocentric theory, or what we also call heliocentrism. So let's begin with Copernicus. Copernicus started the scientific revolution with a book that he wrote called The Starry Messenger, in which he argued that the Earth was not the center of the universe like Aristotle had said it was, but that the sun was, and that the Earth was just one of numerous objects that revolve around the sun, and this was called the heliocentric theory or heliocentrism. The church called heliocentrism preposterous, and Copernicus himself had to admit that his own observations of planetary motion did not make sense mathematically. For example, sometimes Mars seemed to be going forwards, and then sometimes it seemed to be going backwards. Then you have Johannes Kepler. Johannes Kepler got Copernicus's planetary observations to actually make sense mathematically when he discovered the 3 laws of planetary motion. We won't go into those laws, but suffice it to say, those laws are super easy to understand for anybody who's ever played with a yo-yo or who has ever played tetherball. And the one thing that Kepler could not explain was why objects move in the first place. Had a lot of trouble with that one, but then along came Galileo. Galileo was extremely interested in the physics of motion itself. He considered the mechanics of motion to be a fundamental part of science, and he applied advanced mathematics to the study of motion, and he discovered the law of inertia, which said that objects move because being in perpetual motion was their natural state. In other words, Galileo gave science a reason why planets move out there in space. It's a vacuum out there, and these planets are moving because there's nothing preventing them from moving. That's why they're moving. It's their natural state. Well, speaking of vacuums in space, we arrive at Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle created a vacuum right here on Earth with a vacuum pump that he invented. Some scientists, like René Descartes, claimed that vacuums didn't exist, that there were no vacuums, that they couldn't exist. And if vacuums didn't exist, that would mean there's no such thing as outer space. And the theories of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo that we just talked about, they all hinged upon the idea that objects were moving freely out there in the vacuum of space. No vacuum, no space, no heliocentric theory. And so Boyle proved that vacuums could exist. He made one. Hence, one more hurdle down for the heliocentric theory, thanks to Boyle. Boyle also experimented with a lot of gases, and he discovered Boyle's law, which said that as the pressure of a gas increased, its volume increased. Finally, we arrive at Isaac Newton. We could talk a lot about Newton's many accomplishments, but let's concentrate on this theme that we've been following concerning the heliocentric theory. Newton connected the theories of his predecessors, for example, Galileo's observations about objects falling on the Earth, and Kepler's observations about the movement of planets in space. And he discovered the law of universal gravitation, which said that gravity can be measured and that gravity works the same way wherever you are in the universe, whether you're talking about falling objects on the Earth or whether you're talking about planets moving around in space. So now that we've established all that, things might speed up a little bit. So what philosophical movement did the scientific revolution pave the way for? That's a nice, easy, simple question. And this is also another factor that chipped away at those Middle Ages. And that was, of course, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. You can think of the Enlightenment as a greatly expanded version of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution came first, ending around 1687, and the Enlightenment got started after that, kind of ramped up around the 1690s with John Locke. So this next question is, explain how the Enlightenment was similar to the scientific revolution. Well, the biggest similarities between the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution was its interest in natural laws. Both were also very interested in using scientific methods of observation and analysis that we talked about. Both were also very interested in challenging previously held beliefs that didn't seem to hold water anymore. So those were all some similarities. So explain how the Enlightenment was an expansion of the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment looked at natural laws that govern the physical universe, and they said, what if we could identify natural laws that governed human society? What if there were natural laws that govern institutions like, let's say, economics and government and education and the justice system and child rearing and religion? If there are natural laws, then what if that means that people have natural rights, natural laws, natural rights? And if we could identify those laws, what if we could use those laws to take not only ourselves but our entire society to places where it's never been? And that is what these Enlightenment philosophers were after. And so let's identify some famous Enlightenment philosophers and what they advocated for. What did they push for? And the first one we've got is John Locke. And John Locke wrote a book called Two Treatises of Government, which challenged the idea of absolute monarchy. And we talked a lot about absolute monarchy, particularly in the Middle Ages. And Locke said that the power to rule doesn't come from God, like a lot of monarchs said it did. It came from the consent of the people who are being governed. And a government's job was to protect the lives and liberty and property of its citizens. And if the government was not doing its job, then the people had a natural right, there you go, natural rights, to remove that government and change it. Locke's influence on Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, 80 years later, cannot be overstated. And then you've got Montesquieu. And Montesquieu's influence upon our U.S. Constitution, likewise, cannot be overstated. He studied the nature of good, balanced, responsible government with the mind of a scientist. And he wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws. And in this book, he identified such things as the separation of powers in a government: legislative, executive, judicial, and that these powers would be separated into branches so that no one part of the government would have control over the entire government. And he identified a system of checks and balances, rights and privileges that each of these three branches would have and use to keep the other two branches in check. And our Constitution used all of these ideas in the creation of our government. And then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a book called The Social Contract. And in this book, Rousseau described the pathway towards a society in which the citizens recognized not only their own freedom, but also their obligations and their responsibilities to each other as a society. And he described the existence of a thing called the general will. The general will was the will of the people to ultimately put the common good of society above their own personal desires and agendas. And in order for that general will to work, you had to have a population of citizens who were virtuous enough to honor that general will and let it decide things for them. And the way to cultivate that kind of virtue, that kind of civic virtue in the people, was through education. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an Enlightenment philosopher who was also highly interested in education and child rearing. Then we have Voltaire. Voltaire had many accomplishments. Perhaps his biggest influence on us today are his ideas about religious tolerance and religious freedom. He believed that the government should not favor one religion over another religion, and that it shouldn't grant privileges to members of one religion and persecute members of another religion. And that's an important part of our Constitution in numerous places, including the Bill of Rights. Religiously, Voltaire was what was called a deist. He believed that the universe had a creator, but he did not believe in Christianity and he did not believe in the Bible. Instead, his belief in God came from his observation of nature. In other words, the beauty and the wonder of nature told Voltaire everything he needed to know about the existence and the nature of the creator of the universe. And this belief, this deism, influenced many of our founding fathers in the United States who were deists, including Thomas Jefferson. And then you have Adam Smith. Adam Smith was an Enlightenment thinker who applied scientific methods to studying economics and, this is important, market forces, to understand how those things worked and to identify laws that might govern those things. And he wrote about his findings in a book called Wealth of Nations. And in this book, he trashed urban guilds, for example, which he said interfered with market forces by keeping talented people from doing the things that they did best. If there was some trade guild with the authority over an industry, to exclude them. He believed that capitalism, in the form of healthy and fair competition, was good for an economy because people would do a better job in order to get more business if they were allowed to pursue their own self-interests. He believed that the government should interfere with market forces as little as possible, and he described what he called an invisible hand, which would always guide a free and open market in the most efficient and fair direction. So the next question is, explain how the Enlightenment impacted the entire world politically. And that's a very important consequence of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment ideas about such things as balanced government and natural rights and religious freedom and equal justice and consent of the governed and the social contract, etc., they caused a backlash against conservative, authoritarian governments throughout the entire Western Hemisphere and Europe. And the Enlightenment inspired political revolutions such as the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and many other Latin American revolutions. That kind of takes us to Unit 9, which was all about political revolutions. And the first question we have here is something that goes way back, actually. Explain the significance of the Magna Carta. That is also in our final exam. Well, the Magna Carta goes all the way back to the year 1215, deep in the Middle Ages. And the English king, King John II, was forced by his barons, his nobles, to sign this document, the Magna Carta. And it gave his nobles a lot of rights. And he was also, by signing it, signing off on a lot of limitations to his own power as king. Well, keep in mind that this was a time when kings didn't really have that much power to begin with. It was still going to be well over 100 years before monarchs in Europe were really going to start working hard to make themselves more powerful and consolidate and centralize their authority at the expense of their nobles and the church. But the Magna Carta set up the conflict that would occur between kings and their nobles, between rulers and their subjects. And the compromise that was reached between the king and his barons that were specified in the Magna Carta set up a legislative body in England called Parliament. And Parliament would eventually expand to include the participation by not just barons, but also by commoners 80 years later. And this document, the Magna Carta, gave individual rights to the king's barons that would eventually extend to everyone in both English and American government. So that's the significance of the Magna Carta. And then this next question says, explain the significance of England's Glorious Revolution and the document produced by it. What was that document? Well, fast forward 474 years from 1215, the date of the Magna Carta, all the way to 1689. The English Parliament and the English monarchs had been going at each other and competing with each other for power and dominance for almost 500 years between the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution. And they even fought an all-out war against each other in the 1640s, which led to King Charles I being beheaded. We watched the movie. But finally, in the year 1688, the king, James II, was doing things that Parliament found so egregious that they finally said, we're done with this guy. They took him off the throne. They replaced him with his estranged daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange in the Netherlands. And before they took the throne, the deal was they had to sign off on the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And this English Bill of Rights did two things. First, it made Parliament permanently more powerful than the monarch. So the Parliament had more authority than the monarch did from that point on. The second thing it did was it protected the individual rights of every person in England, unless you're a Catholic, then you're out of luck. And that's going to be a huge influence on our American Bill of Rights, which would eventually be added to our U.S. Constitution, except for the anti-Catholic parts. So next, explain how the American Revolution and the French Revolution were different from each other. Well, the biggest difference is that the American Revolution was a political revolution. American society really didn't change at all, although, of course, as we know, the American Revolution started to set a few things in motion. The United States became a republic and had a constitution. And the French Revolution was different. It was political, but it was also very much a social revolution. In other words, the French Revolution changed not only French politics, but French society. France became a republic and had a constitution like the United States, but also it abolished feudalism and slavery. Every male had the right to vote. And the French also sought to export their revolution, and they went to war with several other European countries. The United States didn't do that. And the French Revolution was also sparked by severe economic crisis, which was not the case in the American Revolution. So, how were the American Revolution and the French Revolutions different? Well, the like we said, the biggest similarity is that both revolutions ended the monarchy. Both countries became republics. Both had a democracy. Both resulted in the recognition of individual rights. Both revolutions resulted in an increased participation in the government. All men except slaves could vote. No women could vote or hold office. There were no property requirements for holding public office. So, those are some ways in which the American Revolution and the French Revolution were similar. We've got this next question. We'll go through this pretty quick. Describe these revolutionary leaders, and let's begin with Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar was a revolutionary military leader in the northern part of South America, and he was from what is now Venezuela. He was a Creole, and let's not forget what a Creole is in this day and age. He was inspired by the Enlightenment and by the successes of the American and French revolutions. He liberated 5 modern-day South American countries from their colonial overlords, one of those countries being Venezuela. And he envisioned a unified northern half of South America, but he couldn't pull that off, and it became those 5 countries instead. Then you've got Toussaint Louverture, and Toussaint Louverture was a revolutionary leader in what is now Haiti. It wasn't called Haiti back then. Back then it was called Saint-Domingue. It had been a very profitable French colony, and he helped lead the only successful slave revolt in all of history. So that's some trick. Sadly, Toussaint Louverture actually died before he saw Haiti become an officially independent nation, and he was actually captured by his enemies and taken to France, where he actually died in prison. Then you've got Miguel Hidalgo, and Miguel Hidalgo was a Mexican priest who got Mexico's fight for independence from Spain going. He was also killed relatively early in the long fight that Mexico had for independence, but the campaign he started did not fade, and Mexico finally won its independence from Spain because of his efforts to get that started. Then you have Jose de San Martin, and he was, like Simón Bolívar, he was a South American military liberator, but he was from the southern half of South America. Like Simón Bolívar, whom he briefly met so that they could kind of coordinate their efforts, he also liberated multiple modern-day South American countries, including Argentina. So Unit 9 wasn't too long. Unit 10, Industrialism and Imperialism. So this first task, describe the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, which in many ways is still going on. I mean, what's the latest industrial phenomenon that we've got going? AI and all the incredible and scary things that AI might be capable of. The Industrial Revolution was basically the transition from making manufactured goods by hand in one's home out in the country to making manufactured goods by machine in a factory in the city. And it included all of the radical economic and social and political and cultural consequences of that transition, because that transition is way bigger than I just made it sound. Critical to to this process was, number one, the invention of machines that could do this kind of automated manufacturing. Number two, the energy that those machines needed to do what they did. That power was first and foremost steam power. A third thing to understand about the Industrial Revolution is it began with textiles and iron. It all began in these two key industries and then spread to every other industry from there, especially transportation. So, this next question is explain how this Industrial Revolution that I just described began. And it began in Britain around the 1760s, 1770s. Britain had a combination of lucky factors that made it just about the most likely place on the planet where the Industrial Revolution could begin. And these included such things that we talked about as lots of coal, lots of waterways, including rivers and canals, a culture that valued innovation and valued new ideas, an expensive workforce, a stable government, an advanced banking system, a large commercial market, foreign and domestic, a growing population of workers and customers, an agricultural revolution that supplied this growing population. And these were all things that were going to enable James Watt's radical transformation of the steam engine to change the world. Keep in mind that steam engines had already existed in rudimentary form for decades when the Industrial Revolution started, but they were slow and they were not very powerful and they were expensive to run. And James Watt's simple modification, the condenser, changed all of that. So the next question is identify these innovations of the Industrial Revolution. What do all these machines, spinning jenny, water frame, spinning mule, power loom, steam engine, what do they all have in common? Textiles. The demand for this particular manufactured goods, manufactured clothing, seems to know no limit. It's the cornerstone of the entire Industrial Revolution, and even though the steam engine can be designed to apply power to just about anything, even the steam engine kind of cut its teeth, so to speak, on this particular manufactured good, textiles. So let's begin with the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny was actually a cottage industry device. It spun cotton into fine thread in someone's home. That's what we mean when we say cottage industry. And it was a precursor to the Industrial Revolution. It was hand cranked, which means it was not very powerful. It didn't even use water power. So then you've got the water frame, and this was the first machine that you really couldn't use at home. So cottage industry is starting to become obsolete. It was too big to use at home, and it needed several workers to run it. But most importantly, the water frame was called the water frame because it ran on water power. So it had to be close to a running river that could power the machine. And that made it much more powerful than a spinning jenny. But to work, you had to leave your home and go to it. It wasn't going to come to you. You had to go to where the water frame was located, and a lot of people didn't like that. Also, the water frame could only spin coarse cotton. So after that was done, you had to take that coarse cotton back home and finish spinning it into finer thread with your spinning jenny. So we're seeing a partial transition with the water frame from home to more of a factory type system. Then you got the spinning mule. The spinning mule had the advantages of both those first two developments. It had the fine spinning advantages of a spinning jenny combined with the power of a water frame. So now the full transition to a factory system was well underway with the spinning mule. Then you've got this thing called a power loom. What is a power loom? Well, keep in mind that a loom is a machine that weaves thread, spun thread, into woven fabric. And after the spinning mule started spinning fine thread as efficiently as it did, it became apparent that steam power was going to have to be applied to looms as well. Keep in mind that these spinning machines started off with water power, but as the steam engine is coming along, they're kind of moving away from water power and applying steam power to these machines. So became apparent that this loom was not going to be able to keep up with the power of all of these spinning machines to spin thread for them. Hence the power loom, a steam-powered loom, so that the weaving, which traditionally had no problem keeping up with the spinning process, could now keep up with this much faster spinning. And then finally, we've got the steam engine. Not much to say that we haven't said about the steam engine already. Once you had a powerful machine that could generate rotary power, you could use steam power to do just about anything you wanted. You could power the production of just about any kind of manufactured good, including iron. And it was vital to the increased production of textiles. You could even put it on a vehicle like a train or a ship and use steam to power that vehicle. Describe the economic effects of the Industrial Revolution. Well, the biggest economic effect of the Industrial Revolution was urbanization. And that's people moving from the country to the cities as the production of manufactured goods became more and more machine driven by a lot of these machines that we just described. People had to leave their homes to go to work. And if you're a factory owner, it makes sense for you to move your factory to be closer to more workers, closer to where the workers are, and closer to where your supplies are. And that's the city. And if your factory runs on steam power, well, steam engines can go literally just about anywhere. So factories are moving to the cities, and people are moving to the cities to find work at those factories. Another economic effect of the Industrial Revolution was something you normally wouldn't think of. You'd think it'd just be the opposite with all of this abundance and all of this production. But another effect was poverty. Even though there was significant economic growth, wages for workers didn't go up for generations, and not everybody could contribute to the family income in this kind of urbanized factory system. Children were eventually banned from working in the factories because they were so unsafe. And mom couldn't work at the factory either. Somebody had to take care of the kids because they're not working, they're at home. So the next question is describe not just the economic, but now the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. The growth of these cities that had absolutely no way to prepare for such rapid growth, had a huge social effect, and that was because of the Industrial Revolution. Many cities became crowded and filthy and dangerous and full of poverty and full of crime. Working conditions and living conditions were both horrible for decades. One social effect of all of this was labor reforms. There were laws that had to be passed that made factories cleaner and safer. They took kids out of the factories. They limited the number of hours per day that people could be made to work. And unions formed, which look after the rights and the interests of these factory workers. And these worker unions eventually, some of them became entire political parties. Political parties have ideologies like liberalism and socialism and Marxism and feminism and anarchism, and the list goes on. And all of these were coming from the original desire to improve working conditions. For example, the biggest socialist political party in Britain is literally called the Labor Party. And that name, the Labor Party, harks back to the days when it started as a workers' union. So explain why large development projects like the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal were constructed. And when we see this question, one of the things we see is we're making a transition from the Industrial Revolution to something that was very closely connected to it, which was imperialism. These two big international canals, one between Asia and Africa and one between North America and South America, these were constructed not to benefit the countries where they were located, but to give imperial powers improved access to their colonies, as well as access to their markets and access to their raw materials. Well, that seems kind of strange. What's the connection between then the Industrial Revolution and imperialism? Let's explain this. All of these advancements in manufacturing created new technologies that helped industrialized countries exploit non industrialized territories. Steam power made, for example, steam powered boats and steam powered trains available. They made mass produced weapons like rifles and machine guns available. They even made medicines like quinine available, which could ease the effects of tropical diseases like malaria. And these technologies allowed Europeans to conquer and dominate Asia and Africa more thoroughly than they had ever been able to before. So there's your connection between the Industrial Revolution and this new imperialism that European countries were starting to impose upon Asia and Africa. So the next question is, identify these 19th century scientists and what they accomplished. These scientists are products of what we like to call the Second Industrial Revolution. One of the big differences between the First Industrial Revolution that we first talked about, which was dominated by steam power, and that started around the 1670s, 1660s, like we said, and this newer Second Industrial Revolution that came along about a century later is the scientific advances in things like chemistry and biology and energy production that came along. And we begin with Marie Curie, finally a famous female scientist. Now let's draw a distinction between Newton and Curie. The scientists that were grounded in the scientific revolution believed that the universe was mechanical and that it was bound by the physical laws that we talked about, which made it easy to predict what the universe would do in any given situation. And atoms were thought of as the smallest things in the universe. I mean, that's what made atoms atoms, right? I mean, how you don't get smaller than an atom. But that's the thing about science. You know, just when you think you got it all figured out, a whole new world opens up that you didn't discover before. And Marie Curie was working at a time when some scientists were becoming aware that there was much more going on deep inside atoms than was previously thought. Atoms do things on a subatomic level. And these things that they do, they're not chemical reactions like that you learn about in chemistry, and they're not nearly as predictable as chemical reactions either. And Marie Curie called these subatomic activities radioactivity. Some atoms emit mysterious pulses of energy that she called radiation. And Marie Curie pioneered research in this area, and in so doing, she and her husband discovered two previously unknown elements, radium and polonium. We could talk a lot more about this development that today we call quantum physics or quantum mechanics, but we'll have to stop there and move on to Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur was a scientist who contributed to mankind in a powerful way. He was a pioneer in the discovery of germ theory. He was studying the fermentation process of beer, actually, and he discovered that these tiny living organisms were actually doing the fermentation. And he also found that he could control their rate of activity with heat. Well, what if certain diseases were caused by certain organisms that you could identify that are just teeny tiny? And what if these organisms could be controlled? Think of how much disease you could cure and control and how much death you could prevent. This was the beginning of germ theory, which is a cornerstone of modern medicine. Next question. Describe the causes of this new imperialism of the 19th century. And we talked about it some when we talked about the connection between the Industrial Revolution and the new imperialism. But let's go a little bit further. The main cause of what we often call this new imperialism in Asia and Africa in the 19th century, that's the same as the 1800s, was, like we said, the Industrial Revolution. The main goal of an industrially advanced country is to keep those factories manufacturing goods that you can sell and to keep people working at those factories and earning a paycheck. For that, you need access to two things. Number one, cheap raw materials that you can feed into those factories. And two, markets where you can sell stuff that comes out of those factories. Colonies in Asia and Africa were good for supplying both of those things. So let's describe the effects of new imperialism in the 19th century, and we can do this quite easily. Years of exploitation. That's it. Exploitation of the raw materials of these people, exploitation of their able-bodied workers, and exploitation of their inability to defend themselves against these modern weapons that you have. That takes us to Unit 11, the World Wars. World War I, World War II, and all of the chaos and uncertainty in between. And it says, describe the main causes of World War I. That's a convenient way to remember what those main causes are. Militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and naturalism. So let's talk about what militarism is. Let's describe it. Militarism is the institutionalized glorification of war that countries were doing. It's the idea that war is good for the nation, and that and it's also a buildup of military forces, and it's the unreasoning and unrealistic confidence that your military could easily get the job done against anyone else's military. Next, alliance systems. This is an important one. Countries formed military alliance systems with names like the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente for mutual protection. And this could be a good thing if it kept somebody else from attacking you if you're part of a powerful alliance. But it could also be a bad thing if you become obligated to fight in a war that your country didn't start. And that's what happened in World War I. Imperialism. We just talked about that, of course. European countries competed with each other over colonial territory. Each country was paranoid that a potential adversary, a potential competitor, might have access to cheaper war materials. And colonies were also a source of national pride, and disputes over colonial territory occasionally led to dangerous crises in which war at home was narrowly averted. Next, you've got nationalism. Nationalism, we talked a lot about that. And nationalism has many levels to it, but essentially it's the sense that your country is better and more important than other countries, that your country's needs come first and they come before the needs of any other country, and that your country will always win because it deserves to win. And so those are your four main causes of World War One. Explain the high casualty rates during World War One. And basically it comes down to this: old tactics against new technologies. We've been talking about how all these technologies developed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Well, old tactics against new technologies is how you get millions of soldiers killed. Improved weapons hit the battlefield before anyone really had a chance to devise ways to counter them. So the casualty rate in World War I was really, really high, much higher than World War II. By the time World War II came around, you had these weapons were not so new anymore, even though they were actually quite a bit better than they had been in World War I. But people had come up with ways to counter these weapons by that point. Next question is identify the deadly technical innovations of World War I. So we talked about new technologies and all these high casualty rates. What were some of these technologies? Zeppelins, submarines, poison gas, larger artillery, machine guns. Machine guns and artillery, they were not as new as some of these other weapons, but they were still getting better and better all the time. Describe the effects of World War I. Anywhere, it depends on, nobody will know how many people died in World War I. But it could be anywhere from 15 to 22 million people who died in World War I, both military and civilian, depending on how you count them. Vast areas of Europe were devastated. The cost of the war will never be known for sure, but well over $200 billion in dollars at that time. But most importantly, recovery and reparations took years. There was so much damage to civilian populations and to infrastructure. Next question. Explain how Woodrow Wilson's 14 points influenced the Treaty of Versailles. Well, we talked about this quite a bit as well. At the end of the war, at the end of World War I, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson approached the treaty negotiations at Versailles with what he no doubt thought was a brilliant plan for making sure that nothing as devastating as World War I would ever happen again. Unfortunately, Wilson's 14 points plan showed really a poor understanding of European politics and European geography. For example, he wanted all European countries to give up their colonies because, well, as we know, imperialism was one of the main causes of World War I, so that makes sense. But European imperialists were simply not going to do things like that just because Wilson's 14 points said that they should. One thing from the 14 points that did make it into the Treaty of Versailles, a highly flawed treaty, as we talked about, was Wilson's idea of having a League of Nations, a body which would settle disputes, an international body. It would settle disputes between nations without having to resort to war. But several nations were not even invited to join the League of Nations, including Germany, including the Soviet Union. And the U.S. Senate did not approve the U.S. joining of the League of Nations. So the U.S. didn't join the League of Nations, even though the U.S. president was the one that proposed it. It was his idea. Next question. Describe the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And these reasons that I'm going to kind of laundry list for you and describe, they're all related. There were the recovery and reparations that European countries had to try to pay for. And they desperately needed a continuous supply of loans for these reparations. So that's one factor. Another factor was the overproduction of consumer goods such as cars and houses and agricultural products in the United States. This caused the market for these things to collapse because there was just too much supply. Next, there was over speculation in the stock market, including the practice of, we call it buying on the margin, borrowing money in order to buy more stocks with money that you borrowed from the bank. The belief at the time was that this was going to be totally safe because the stock market couldn't possibly go down, much less collapse. Another related reason was inadequate safeguards for banks. Even banks were getting in on the act of speculating on the stock market with their depositors' money. And next, there was misguided government policies. For example, the Dawes Plan. Under this Dawes Plan, U.S. banks would loan Germany the money to fund the war reparations that they owed to Britain and France. And then Britain and France would then use this money to repay the money that they had borrowed from U.S. banks. So U.S. banks were vulnerable. If anything in this cycle failed, if any country in Europe failed in any way to keep up their end of the Dawes Plan, then U.S. banks were going to be pretty messed up. Describe the causes of the rise of totalitarianism in the 1920s and 1930s. This is a combination of economic problems and social problems. That's important. Germany and Italy came out of the war really as losers. Germany had the humiliation of the war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles. They were feeling extremely bitter about that. And Italy, though they were technically on the winning side of World War I, they were virtually ignored at the Versailles Conference when they pressed for what they had been promised in return for joining the war. So in both Italy and Germany, there were deep, ugly feelings of betrayal and grievance at the end of World War I. In Germany, in particular, there was this nationalistic feeling that the only way that they could possibly have lost the war was if they had been stabbed in the back by, who knows, you name it, the government, the communists, the Jews, anybody they could blame. And on top of that, there were severe economic problems, the cost of war reparations, the hyperinflation of 1923, and finally, the Great Depression. These two problems, economic problems and social problems, opened the door for totalitarians to come along to take advantage of these ugly feelings of resentment and fear and say, follow me, I'll fix it. I'll punish the people who betrayed you, and I'll restore you to the greatness to which you are entitled. Give me your loyalty because I am the only one who can do this. I'm your salvation. I'm your greatness. And the worse the economic situation became in these countries, the better totalitarians like Hitler and Mussolini and Francisco Franco in Spain did. And that kind of brings us to this thing called fascism. Describe fascism. If you're confused about what fascism is, then you're not really alone. There are no fully agreed upon definitions for fascism. The best way to get your head around fascism is to identify the most common characteristics. The most confusing thing about fascism is that it's not really built around a particular ideology. It's actually built around a person, a charismatic leader who demands complete power and complete personal loyalty. And in fascism, there's only one political party, right? His political party. All others are outlawed. So there's no one who can oppose him or criticize him. So he can pass any laws he wants to. He controls the economy. He controls the media. The closest thing to an ideology that fascism has is nationalism. Germany first. Italy first. America first. This nationalism often has some kind of a mythological origin story attached to it, which determines who is included and who is excluded, who is entitled and who is not, who is worthy and deserving and who is not. And the most obvious way to determine who is in and who is out is along racial lines. So fascists are often racists, and they're often pro-war as a way to demonstrate and restore the nation's greatness. So let's describe some similarities between fascism and this other thing that we call totalitarianism. Obviously, fascism and totalitarianism are very similar, except that totalitarians can also be ideologically driven, like communists. Stalin was a communist, and he was also a totalitarian. But we don't generally call Stalin a fascist, even though, in my opinion, there are plenty of reasons why we could call him a fascist. Where does the term totalitarian come from? Well, it comes from the word total, of course. Totalitarians want total control over every aspect of the lives of their subjects, how they live, what they see, what they hear, what they read, what they think, what they believe, and who lives and who dies. So this next question comes right down the line. Explain how the Nazis brought about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a study in how dictators approach the most outrageous things that they have planned for us. And it happens in small, incremental stages that the people will accept one at a time. And then you wait a while, and then you take another small step, and then you keep your ultimate goal a secret, your ultimate end game. Nobody knows what that is as you take your steps. Hitler didn't come into power in 1933 and announce at 8 o'clock day one, hey, we're killing all the Jews. First, he enacted laws to take away their rights and their citizenship, and the Germans accepted that. Then he turned the Germans against them with hate speech and propaganda, which he controlled, of course. Later, he found an excuse to launch a nationwide riot to destroy Jewish businesses and Jewish synagogues. And then he made Jews wear yellow stars on their clothes. He moved Jews to ghetto areas. And then, after a period of years, he turned to the murder of Jews in a massive industrial killing complex known as the Holocaust, which killed millions of people. He didn't just announce that on the first day. So, describe the implications of atomic weapons. Well, World War II ended when we deployed 2 atomic weapons over Japan. Up to that point, Japan was never going to surrender. They were going to go down in this suicidal blaze of glory. But when those bombs hit, the Japanese government changed their minds almost immediately and surrendered unconditionally. That's how devastating these 2 bombs were. And now we have the power to destroy all life on this planet. We can make this planet literally uninhabitable. World War II killed over 50 million people. And you're the next generation. It's going to be up to your generation to make sure that World War III doesn't come along and make 50 million dead people look like nothing. And this is why we study history. This is why Albert Einstein is supposed to have made the comment, I don't know what weapons will be used in World War III, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. What he meant by that was World War III, if it ever happens, will knock us back into the Stone Age if we're lucky enough to survive at all. So that brings us to Unit 12, the Cold War and independence movements. The first question is describe the political and economic conflict between what were called the superpowers. The 2 most powerful countries that came out on top of World War II were the Soviet Union and the United States. And these countries feared and distrusted each other with great intensity. The Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe, which they had conquered in their fight against the Nazis, and the United States dominated Western Europe likewise. And the Soviet Union was a communist country, and this means two things. First, they were a non-democratic one-party system. And second, it meant that they had a command economy that was completely government controlled and that did not allow for private ownership of business of any kind. The United States was a multi-party democracy with a capitalist free market economy. So each of these two countries, these two superpowers, had a very different vision for the world, and these two countries and their allies competed vigorously for the dominance of their views all over the world for over 40 years. So this next question, explain how the U.S. policy of containment succeeded in Europe but failed in Asia. Well, shortly after World War II ended, Truman instituted this policy called containment. And the way it works was this, that the West, the democracies, capitalist countries, they would leave communism alone where it was, but would campaign everywhere else to keep it from spreading. Containment had some successes and it had some failures. One of its biggest successes was in West Berlin, the city of West Berlin. Remember that Germany at the end of World War II was divided into 4 occupational zones among the 4 victorious allies in World War II: United States, Soviet Union, France, and England. And correspondingly, Germany's capital city of Berlin was also divided into 4 occupational sectors, even though the city lay completely inside the Soviet Union's Eastern occupational zone. This became a source of great tension between the Western democracies and the Eastern communists because the West controlled this thriving democratic island of free market capitalism in the middle of a communist territory. And the Soviet Union made one big attempt to starve the West out of West Berlin in 1948. The West responded with the Berlin airlift, which basically saved the Western Allies' control over West Berlin by flying enough supplies to sustain the city by air. In 1961, the East decided, well, if you're not going to leave West Berlin, if you're going to insist on maintaining possession of it, we'll just build a wall across the entire city to separate your western half from our eastern half. And that wall stayed in place until 1989. But in Asia, containment didn't do so well. China fell to communism in 1949. In 1946, communist North Korea was established. Vietnam became communist in 1975, and that was after we fought for 8 years to contain communism there. Didn't work. So the next question is, describe the effects of the Cold War. There were several effects of the Cold War. We've already talked about the danger and the destructiveness of nuclear weapons. We've already talked about the Cold War competition between Western democracies led by the United States and Eastern communist countries led by the Soviet Union. One of the most significant effects was a nuclear arms race that lasted for decades. Both countries invested massive amounts of money into having the bigger nuclear stockpile. And finally, starting with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and Russia have signed various treaties that have reduced the number of nuclear weapons between our two countries significantly. Explain how the Korean and Vietnam wars were similar. We fought communists in Korea for 3 years, and we fought communists in Vietnam for 8 years. And in both cases, the communist forces wanted to unify their countries under one single communist government. We fought to a standstill in Korea, resulting in 2 Koreas with a heavily armed, demilitarized zone between them to this day. There's a communist North Korea, which is one of the most isolated and poorest countries in the world. And then there's democratic, free market South Korea, where Squid Game and all the other Korean television shows on Netflix came from, and where all of K-pop comes from. So the next one, describe the causes of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Between 1989 and 1991, communism throughout Eastern Europe collapsed spectacularly, ending with the total collapse of the communist Soviet Union itself. No country with a communist government has figured out how to make a command economy run by the government produce as much prosperity as a free market economy. And no communist country has figured out how to expand participation in government or expand individual rights and maintain communism at the same time. A main cause of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe was that the people of Eastern Europe could see how much more prosperity and how much more personal freedom people in the West were enjoying in their free market economies directly on the other side of the Iron Curtain from them. And there was simply no hiding the obvious gap in abundance between the East and the West. We're almost to the end. Describe the roles of each of these people, these four people, in the collapse of communism. So let's just briefly describe each one and what they did. First, we've got Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan became president of the United States in 1981, and he served 2 terms and went on a relentless campaign to destroy the Soviet Union's image and undermine its confidence. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He traveled to West Berlin and challenged the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, the Berlin Wall. Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa was a Polish electrician who became the leader of a shipyard trade union. Now we're talking about trade unions again. And the name of that trade union was Solidarity. He challenged the East Bloc Polish communist government to grant this union the legal right to exist and to negotiate on behalf of its members, these shipyard workers. And that union eventually transitioned into a full-fledged political party. We talked about how unions can do this previously in this review. Remember that? Solidarity, now as a political party, not just a trade union, but as a political party, ran against Poland's Communist Party in free elections and defeated the Communist Party. If you run against the Communist Party and you defeat the Communist Party, your country's not communist anymore. They're out. And so Solidarity took the power of government from the Communist Party in Poland. That kind of got the ball rolling. Another important figure was Pope John Paul II. This was the Polish Pope of the Catholic Church. And the Polish people are devoutly Catholic. And it was very encouraging to the Polish people when Pope John Paul II toured all over Poland, giving sermons and giving masses and giving speeches, telling the people of Poland to stand up to communism and not to be afraid. This gave them a lot of motivation to continue to defy their communist government. And there was nothing that the communist government could do about it. They had no control over the Catholic Pope. Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the leader of the Soviet Union and by default leader of all of communist Eastern Europe. He was the last leader of the Soviet Union. He took a risk and he began to introduce major reforms into the Soviet system in hopes that it would turn the Soviet economy around. And these included such policy changes as glasnost, which means cultural openness, and perestroika, which meant an economic restructuring to allow small amounts of capitalism to loosen the bonds of this communist command economy. He also refused to crack down on organizations like Solidarity in Poland, even when they challenged the authority of Poland's communist government. These efforts, glasnost, perestroika, the easing of all these restrictions, refusing to crack down on dissent, these efforts backfired on Mikhail Gorbachev. And in 1989, revolutions started to break out across the satellite states of Eastern Europe, in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Communist governments started falling all over the place. And eventually, this revolutionary fervor spread to the Soviet Union itself. In 1990, Lithuania declared itself an independent republic. And Lithuania was not an Eastern European satellite state. Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union itself. And this signaled the end of the Soviet Union. Even an economic blockade of Lithuania couldn't stop this trajectory that was going with this collapse of communism. And finally, in December of 1991, the Soviet government voted to dissolve itself. And that was the end of the Soviet Union. Let's get to decolonization. That's another big part of this Cold War thing. Explain how Mohandas Gandhi was able to win independence for India from Great Britain. Gandhi, we studied him. He was the leader of India's independence movement for decades. India was Great Britain's largest, oldest, and most profitable colony. And the means that Gandhi used against the British government were somewhat unusual. You can call it passive resistance. You can also call it nonviolent non-cooperation. It's the same thing, really. And after a long struggle, Gandhi finally won independence for India in 1947. Describe the challenges that newly independent African nations have experienced since World War II. Some independence movements went smoothly, some did not. In many cases, European imperialist powers just left these countries in poverty and in political chaos. European powers often used one ethnic group against another to their own advantage. And then when they left, the ethnic strife and resentment that they had fostered remained behind. And a good example of this was the Rwandan genocide. Often these countries were so politically unstable that corrupt strongmen would come in and take over, who did nothing to advance the welfare of their countries. They simply advanced their own agendas and their own personal interests. Well, we don't have much more now. 3 more questions. Explain how the Arab-Israeli conflict began. Israel declared its existence in the year 1948. It had the backing of the United Nations, and they established their nation in Palestine by force in a war that took months. And this was known as the First Arab-Israeli War or Arab-Israeli conflict. They fought several Arab countries in the area at the same time who absolutely refused to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And when this whole war was all over, Israel was established, and the Palestinian people who had been living there in those territories already that Israel had taken when they won this war, were displaced. And it's been a bad situation ever since, and there are no heroes on either side. And that takes us to our last and briefest unit, Unit 13, Contemporary and Interdependent World. Describe the phenomenon of terrorism. Terrorists are people, as we know, who try to intimidate governments to give in to their demands by using extreme violence, mostly against innocent civilians, although they do sometimes choose military targets. They've used bombings, rockets, hijackings of ships and airplanes, machine guns, stabbings. Now there's even cyber terrorism. The year 2000 attack on the USS Cole is an example. 9/11 is an example. And there are two big takeaways that we want to keep in mind with regard to global terrorism. Number one, terrorism is used by many different groups with many different agendas, not just radical Islamic groups. Number two, by far, the greatest number of people killed by radical Islamic terrorism are other Muslims, other Islamic people. Third thing, overall deaths from terrorism have been declining. And number four, in the West, religiously motivated terrorism is way down, and politically motivated terrorism is on the rise. So those are four things to keep in mind about terrorism. And one last question. Describe the positive effects of globalization. Globalization's been a mixed bag, as we have studied. It has increased pollution. It has increased the wealth gap between countries. But on the upside, the exchange of goods and services has gone way up. So our course really ends where it began, with trade. So that's our review. I hope it solidifies things for you. I hope that it helps you finish the year strong with a great score on this final exam. Thank you very much.